I have, there's some flux in my title. I have changed the subtitle slightly since I submitted it. So it's now Sustainable Uncertainty, Nature, Heritage and Change. So still within the same sort of area at least. I didn't have to think long when the organizers contacted me and asked me whether I would consider giving a paper here. I was very intrigued by the conference title, Confronting Uncertainty, Heritage, Pasts and Presents in Flux. And I also found the conference abstract very interesting. And I just want to start by a small, brilliant abstract, and I've taken the liberty to put it partly in my own words, so apologies for that. You say here that heritage is used as an anchor, a generator of certainty that keeps our senses of self and identity secure, and therefore that heritage is turned to as a constant in times of change. But as you point out, this sense of security and this perceived stability of heritage is today being increasingly unsettled by various challenges. And it's this uncertainty that you've asked us to explore over the course of these 2 days, and not least the link between heritage and uncertainty. And this here really speaks to me. I think it connects to what I have been working on previously, which was mentioned briefly in the introduction, and it also speaks to my current research. So I'm probably not entirely neutral, but I think this proposal is very timely. I think it's very important to address these topics. And I really agree with you that it's important to not only address it as a problem or a threat to be solved by seeking ways to reduce uncertainty, but equally that we talk about uncertainty in constructive ways, that we see uncertainty as a sort of genuine state of the world that we just have to, in some ways, endure with and face. So my aim with this paper is to try to respond to this call and to confront uncertainty in a constructive manner, somewhat, and hence the title, Sustainable Uncertainty. And as the title also indicates, sustainability will be a central theme here, and not least then the relationship between sustainability and uncertainty. And I'm going to talk about these topics or themes in context of my current research on natural heritage and heritage landscapes. And I'll be focusing specifically on Iceland, on East Iceland in particular, and on a UNESCO listed heritage landscape located here, which I will introduce later on. And I should mention that, and I'll come back to that also, that this is very much work in not even in process. It's like very recently started. So I really appreciate your feedback on this. And what I will be presenting now is mainly, it's basically like a project outline. It's what I intend to explore further, and less of a presentation of results, basically. So first, a brief overview of how I will structure my talk. I'm going to begin with some background. I'll explain a little bit where I'm coming from, with focus on a project that I'm working on now, which is called Relics of Nature, an archaeology of natural heritage in the High North. And I'll talk briefly about what we're doing in this project, the questions that we're raising, and say something about the perspectives and theories that we're drawing on in this project, because this will also provide some background to the issues that I want to raise later on. From there, I will proceed to talk about the concept of sustainability. this is one of the central topics that we're working with in Relics of Nature. One of three main work packages in the project is focused on the concept of sustainability. And so what I now want to explore is how sustainability features in heritage discourses today and how it's framed in relation to heritage. After that, I will bring in the case study that I mentioned. I'm going to, as I said, introduce you to a specific landscape in the inland and highland of eastern Iceland, and specifically the Vatnajökull National Park, which is a recent addition to UNESCO's World Heritage List as Natural World Heritage. And I also want to say that this particular area, this World Heritage area and Eastern Iceland is where I come from. It's where I grew up. And I've also worked as an archaeologist in this area before, a long time ago, between 2004 and 2008. And I'm now revisiting. I still have family in the area, so I'm there all the time, but not as an archaeologist. But now I'm again revisiting the place in relation to this Relics of Nature project. So it is a bit of a personal journey in a sense. And finally, I will return to the concept of sustainability again, and with reference to the case study, I will try to reflect on what sustainability is, and asking also what kind of sustainability we may need or want today in the Anthropocene, if you like. So I'll start with the background. And like I said, the context for this talk is a research project that I'm currently part of. The project is called, again, Relics of Nature and Archaeology of Natural Heritage in the High North. And what you see here is the front page of the project's website. And if you haven't visited the website, I encourage you to do so. It is already interesting. I am quite hopeful that it will become more interesting as our work progresses. But and here you see the list of fabulous and interdisciplinary team of people that I'm working with in this project. And I also want to draw your attention to this photograph that you see on our website. This is from the area that I am going to introduce to you later on. This is called Kárahnjúkar Canyon. And this specific canyon and spot has been voted the most photogenic spot in Iceland quite recently. And I just ask you to keep it, to have a look and keep it in your mind, and I'll return to it later on. Just a brief mention of the research questions that the sort of general research questions that we're working with in this project. We are focusing on natural heritage, and we're interested in asking, how is natural heritage constituted? How is it defined? What measurements are at play in that definition? And what understandings of nature are sort of grounding those definitions? And we are quite inspired by, amongst others, Kárahnjúkar, who argues that measurements are not simply revelatory, but performative, that they help to constitute the phenomenon that is being measured. That measurements, therefore, are world-making, and that what is at stake then is the very nature of nature, as she puts it. And we can think of heritage as one measurement of this sort, or natural heritage, if you like, as one measurement of that sort. Yeah, and as the title of the project indicates, also the project is anchored in archaeology. I am an archaeologist, but it is an interdisciplinary project as well. And we also have roots in heritage studies and in environmental humanities generally. And with members then coming from different directions, from different disciplines, people also bring with them, of course, different perspectives into the project. But to generalize and to give you an idea, we draw heavily in this project on some particular and current theoretical schools in the humanities and social sciences, which partly at least could be embraced within labels such as object-oriented ontology, new materialism, and post-humanism. And what unites these perspectives and what makes them important for us in this project is that they offer new approaches and understandings of phenomena such as nature and ecology and care and so on. So I've listed here just a few works that have inspired me in particular, and also other members of the team. And I'm not going to dwell on this, but just to mention them, we have first the wonderful book by Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, Prismatic Ecology, Eco-Theory Beyond Green, which is an absolutely fabulous book, one of my favorites. So if you haven't had a look at that, please do so. We also have Maria Puig de la Bella Casa, Matters of Care, Speculative Ethics in More Than Human Worlds. And you can hear that by the titles of these works, sort of what the direction they are taking us in. We have Timothy Morton's Dark Ecology for a Logic of Future Coexistence. And I've also listed his previous work, Ecology Without Nature. We have Philippe Descola, The Ecology of Others, and also his seminal work on Beyond Nature and Culture. And then finally, these two wonderful books that you have here by Anat Singh and Donna Haraway, The Mushroom at the End of the World on the Possibility of Life in Capitalist Ruins, the idea of enduring with uncertainty, by Anat Singh, and Staying with the Trouble, Making Kin in the Cthulhu by Donna Haraway. And they are both, of course, focused on current environmental challenges and on the art of not turning away, but facing these challenges and enduring with them and with uncertainty. And I could also mention that there is, of course, a lot of work to draw on within heritage studies, and this is just to mention a few scholars, such as Caitlin De Silvi, who is also part of the Relics of Nature team, and Rodney Harrison. I could also mention others who are in this room. But for example, Caitlin and Rodney have suggested more constructive ways of dealing with processes of change, decay, and loss through concepts such as curated decay, which is the title of Caitlin's book, and also in a very recent co-written paper by the two, an adaptive release. So this is just to give you an idea about what we're drawing on and where to sort of place us and the Relics of Nature project. Okay, our focus in Relics of Nature is on natural heritage. But that said, what we're most interested in is the often difficult categorization of heritage landscapes, how they often resist being divided into these assumed categories of nature and culture. And I like to talk about difficult heritage in that relation. We tend to think of that concept, difficult heritage, as a very specific kind of heritage. And we talked about some difficult heritage yesterday. So it's difficult in a very specific way. We might, but I think it's important to be reminded that all heritage is quite difficult, and especially when we talk about the categorization and labeling of heritage. So we might consider extending or expanding that labeling. And I have myself been working with this kind of difficult heritage for quite some time, and partly through the material that you see on the screen here, which I called drift matter. It's seaborne debris, basically, which represents quite directly how difficult these categories are. And I think not only metaphorically, because I don't approach this material as a symbolic metaphor for how categories become blurred and mixed. I think it's quite literally expressive of how difficult it is and how things slip out, how they drift beyond our namings and framings and categories and so on. But my previous work with this particular material has been very firmly anchored in archaeology, and I've been asking myself basically how to deal with this material as archaeological material. And so my approach has also been mainly from the perspective of cultural heritage. But what I'm trying to do now in my current research in Relics of Nature is to start from the opposite end of the spectrum with natural heritage. Also because I feel that there is sometimes a lack of dialogue between research in cultural and natural heritage respectively, and that the two could really benefit from more frequent exchange of thoughts and of concepts and practices. So, natural heritage. If we look at official definitions of natural heritage, it is described mostly as purely natural, as not man-made. Feature sites and areas that constitute outstanding value because of their beauty, because of their uniqueness, because of their significance for science, or because they are important in order to sustain valued and endangered flora and fauna. So nature, or the nature of natural heritage, is often framed as more or less free of cultural influence. And the sustainability of this heritage is often based on keeping that balance or that distinction. We do, however, have landscapes that are considered to be of mixed natural and cultural significance. And this has been recognized for a long time by national and international heritage authorities. But still, bringing these two categories together has proven to be very difficult in many ways. And this is clearly reflected, I don't know if you see that, but this is clearly reflected in the distribution of UNESCO World Heritage listings, where at present the out of the close to 1,200 heritage sites listed, only 39 are mixed. So apart from speaking to the strong cultural bias of heritage understandings and the binary thinking that grounds the separation of natural and cultural heritage, I think this also shows the difficulty of living up to the harmony that is expected to constitute an acceptable combination of the two. And in Relics of Nature, we argue that this bias has to some extent also affected attempts to include nature and natural heritage in critical heritage studies. Because even though there is a concern also for nature, much of the scholarship within critical heritage studies is driven from an a priori cultural or cultural heritage point of departure, where nature and the natural is still largely subject to cultural measure. So even though the growing concern for non-human agency, for post-humanism perspectives, and for more flat ontologies may in theory have made the culture-nature binary stand out as completely outdated, the actual blurring of the divide seems to remain remarkably one-directional, and even to the degree that it sometimes amounts to an implicit cultural appropriation of nature. For example, when we talk about the significant relations between humans and animals and plants and landscapes and so on, these relations are mostly articulated through culturally and not least positively loaded concepts like kinship and communion. And we see this also clearly in heritage contexts, where this positive and balanced depiction of nature and of nature-culture relations is described through concepts such as nurturing, well-being, continuity, health, resilience, and sustainability. So to generalize, it appears that concerns for nature and natural heritage have, in other words, mostly involved making nature part of our beyond through a delegation of values that we deem as culturally significant and not least desirable. And sustainability is one of these positively inflated technical concepts or imaginaries, we could say, that is used in this endeavor. So to continue to the next chapter of this talk, let's take a further look at the concept of sustainability. What is sustainability and how does it feature in natural heritage discourse? Sustainability first gained its popularity when it was adopted in the UN report Our Common Future in 1987, the so-called Brundtland report. And here, sustainability or sustainable development was explained as, and I quote, development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Today, sustainability has in many ways become the mantra of both environmental and heritage discourses, and the concept appears to be more or less automatically tied to management and conservation in both spheres, in both heritage and environmental spheres. But what sustainability actually implies is rarely discussed in much detail. It's simply taken for granted and expected to lead to a common good. And one person who has reacted to this and written quite a bit about this taken for grantedness of sustainability is this fantastic lady here, Sheila Yazanov, who is Professor of Science and Technology Studies at Harvard University and who just recently received the Olberg Prize for her work within the humanities and social sciences. And reacting to just this, to this fixation or this reification and blackboxing of sustainability, Sheila Yazanov has argued that sustainability is perhaps the grandest socio-technical imaginary of our time, as it projects both human and planetary futures into unlimited time. And then she goes further to define what she means by these socio-technical imaginaries. And she says, these are collectively held, sorry, I quote, these are collectively held, institutionally stabilized and publicly performed visions of desirable futures, which are animated by shared understandings of forms of social life and social order, attainable through and supportive of advances in science and technology. And talking about this, Yazanov is specifically pointing to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as such a place where these collective imaginaries of sustainability become institutionally produced and stabilized today. And I completely agree with her on that, but I would also add that I think we could point towards UNESCO as another or a similar kind of authoritative body where sustainability and not least the heritage sustainability constellation becomes produced and stabilized today. And to continue with Yazanov's theorization about this, she tries to explain how this production of sustainability happens, or production and stabilization of sustainability, how it happens. And she says that it becomes realized, or it becomes realized through certain rhetorical techniques. And I'm going to list here four such rhetorical techniques that work towards stabilizing and sort of black boxing the idea about sustainability. And firstly, it happens by through making it normative, by fixing the sustainable future as ultimately good and therefore a place worth fighting for, she says. Secondly, by making it collective, by framing the sustainable future as ultimately inclusive and attainable for everyone, it becomes an unquestionable common goal for everyone. Thirdly, by making it tractable, by describing the sustainable future not in terms of not in abstract terms, but through measurements and calculation. So through maps and numbers and graphs and so on, it is made manageable or made to appear to be manageable and applicable in all circumstances. And then fourth, by making it accountable, by attaching the sustainable future to specific authoritative voices and institutions like the IPCC and UNESCO, the sustainable future is sort of removed from the panel of social debate to a higher order of an already accepted good. It's not up for discussion. And what all this does is that it makes the sustainable future and sustainability as a phenomenon non-debatable, basically. It becomes a fixed and stabilized as an object of certainty and not as a future full of uncertainty and unknowns. So as framed by Yazanov, sustainability is first and foremost a vision, an imaginary of a desirable future, which becomes promoted and stabilized through certain institutional technologies. And because of that, she also says, we need to be attentive to the politics at play in the collective imagining of sustainability. Socio-technical imaginaries are more than ideas. They bring material projects into being, they justify them, and thereby open up or close down competing options for how to govern transitions towards sustainability. In other words, the production of sustainability, and not least this stabilization of the concept, is a highly political business. And we could claim further that the extremely wide circulation of the sustainability concept and the apparent lack of discussion about what it actually means could be taken as an indicator of the unquestionable authority of the institutions producing it, such as the IPCC and UNESCO. So towards the sustainability and heritage constellation. Like I said, the theme of sustainability can be traced back to 1987, to the Brundtland report, but sustainability as such doesn't feature in the context of heritage until much later. And the first official mentioning of sustainability or sustainable development by the World Heritage Committee appears only in 2002 in the Budapest Declaration. But since then, the heritage sustainability constellation has become more or less normalized in UNESCO's discourse, and also, I'd say, in heritage discourse more generally. And still, it's only in 2015 that sustainable development perspectives are officially integrated into the World Heritage Convention through this document that you see here. A policy document adopted at the 20th General Assembly of the State Parties. And this policy document is interesting. As you can, this is my version of it. It's very interesting in many ways. It does, first of all, acknowledge that the World Heritage Convention from 1972 does not make any specific mention of the term sustainable development. But despite this, the policy document is still very optimistic when it comes to the role of the World Heritage Convention in the implementation of sustainability worldwide. And it states that, and I quote, sustainability, broadly defined, is inherent to the spirit of the World Heritage Convention. And further, that by identifying, protecting, conserving, presenting, and transmitting to present and future generations irreplaceable cultural and natural heritage properties of outstanding universal value, the World Heritage Convention is in itself contributes significantly to sustainable development and the well-being of people. So what is stated here is in a sense that sustainability automatically comes with heritage protection. And further down, the document also says that the integration of a sustainable development perspective into the World Heritage Convention will enable all stakeholders involved in its implementation to act with social responsibility. This process will enhance World Heritage as a global leader and standard setter for best practice, also by helping to promote through the over 1,000 listed properties worldwide, innovative models of sustainable development. So again, what this document really communicates is this common belief that the mere protection of heritage sites or the natural environment is in itself fulfilling a sustainable development objective. And even without much effort, that it is also promoting best practice in that field. So again, to return then to Yazanov's socio-technical imaginaries of sustainability, as I read this document, I would argue that UNESCO is doing exactly what she describes as the stabilization of the heritage sustainability constellation. It is made to appear automatic, as completely normative, as ultimately open and inclusive, as manageable and calculable, and of course, as naturally inherent to UNESCO's traditional principles and practice. And while the document is launched as an integration of sustainable development perspectives into the World Heritage Convention, it isn't really altering anything. Sustainability is at the outset seen as already inherent to the spirit of heritage protection, and therefore that UNESCO is doing, and therefore what UNESCO is doing here is in many ways to sort of close down the idea about what sustainability or sustainable development is, rather than inviting anyone to dialogue on that matter. The relationship between heritage and sustainable development becomes fixed and stabilized as an object of certainty again, and not as a matter of future uncertainty and unknowns. But then I would ask, is this the kind of sustainability that we want and need today? And what kind of best practices could World Heritage sites offer? And to try to, I will not answer that question or those questions, but to try to reflect on them at least, I'm going to bring in the case study, which again is the Vatnajökull National Park and its surrounding landscape in East Iceland. And the Vatnajökull National Park was initially established in 2008 and is now Iceland's third and latest addition to the World Heritage List. It was added in 2019 as natural heritage under criterion 8, which has to do with earth history and record of life. The property, as you can see, is enormous. It's huge. It covers over 14% of Iceland's total landmass and 25% of the Central Highlands. 85% of the property is classified as wilderness, and this includes Vatnajökull itself, which is Europe's largest glacier. And the property also contains the world's best exposed mid-ocean ridge volcanic system that is not underwater, which is a volcanic system that cuts through all of Iceland from southwest to northeast and partly through that national park. And within the national park, this system includes 10 central and active volcanoes. So the area is seen as offering not least a unique natural laboratory of glacial-volcanic interaction and also glacial reaction to climate change, because Vatnajökull is a very young glacier, so it's very sensitive to climate change. So it's an extremely dynamic landscape, as you can understand. It's geologically young. and still very visible. It's still in very visible formation through processes of volcanic and glacial activities, through the many glacial rivers that radiate out from Vatnajökull glacier, and through wind erosion. It's also an extremely varied landscape, as you can see on these images here. It has a rich plant and wildlife and is, for example, the main habitat of the Icelandic reindeer and of wild geese. So it's quite extraordinary in many ways. As I mentioned, 85% of the property is classified as wilderness. And in UNESCO's evaluation, the landscape's integrity is described as reflected in the inclusion of entire and intact landscape and geophysical units in minimal human use and intervention and scientific interest in the property. So the nature culture distinction is clearly emphasized in the World Heritage designation of the area. And a further indication of this is the repeated references in both the nomination document and the designation document to the landscape's wilderness and uniqueness, where the only parallels mentioned in the evaluation report are the uninhabited planets of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, which I find hilarious. But I want to bring your or draw your attention to a specific area on the map you see here behind me, to one of the large river corridors that radiate out from Vatnajökull glacier, the river corridor of Jökla glacial river. As you can see, this is an area just beyond. It's just this blue line is the border of the park, the World Heritage property, and this is the area I want you to focus on. So it's just beyond the border of the national park. And yet this particular area and this particular river corridor had everything to do with the initial constitution of the national park in 2008, and eventually the World Heritage Site in 2019. The lake you see in the middle of this area here is called Hauslón. And it is in fact the reservoir of the Kárahnjúkar hydroelectric power plant, which is Iceland's by far largest hydropower plant. It was opened for operation in 2009, 1 year after the initial establishment of Vatnajökull National Park, with the one aim of the one main functioning of feeding electricity to the Alcoa. To the Alcoa, which is a town not far away. The decades leading up to the opening of this plant in 2009 were colored by, on the one hand, arguments for the necessity of the plant and the workplaces and revenue that it would secure, and on the other hand, protests against it and against the environmental destruction that it would involve. And this is the area and the atmosphere that I grew up in. I was both observer and part of the protest. I sided with the environmentalists and saw the future of East Iceland as better saved by something else than heavy industry. But I also didn't feel completely at home in what eventually became the dominating discourse of the environmental movement. As the years went by and it became ever more clear that the fight was lost, the protests became occupied to a large degree by activists who were not local to the area. And while their support was very much appreciated, their voices completely downplayed the more subtle and less rhetorical voices of the local farmers and users of this land. As in the later World Heritage designation, the rhetoric was that this was untouched land. nature not interfered with by human, a wilderness on par with Jupiter, Mars, and Saturn, the land of reindeer and wild geese. And this was, of course, partly true. But what I also knew to be true was that this land was the summer pasture of sheep, that when farmers in the neighboring valleys collected their flocks in the autumn, they stopped to rest and drink by the many turf and stone-built sheds in the area. I knew that they also fished the lakes, hunted the wild geese, and collected their eggs. And so do I. And I knew that the reindeer, now considered natives to the land, had been introduced in the 19th century, brought in from Finnmark in northern Norway. I knew that when there was lack of land in the lowland and along the coast in the 18th and 19th century, optimistic pioneers were driven to build their farms up here in the highlands, and that many of these farms were then deserted during the volcanic eruption of Aska in 1875. I knew that throughout history, this area had occasionally been occupied by outlaws, not to mention all the ghosts and hidden people and other supernatural beings that occupied the stories about this land and which I grew up with. I knew that the land was lined with old pathways where rosaries of cairns led the way to safe fords on rivers and to cable cars across canyons. And I knew that every creek and every hillock and every stone in this land had a name, and sometimes more than one. I knew that my informants, whom I interviewed in relation to an archaeological survey and rescue excavation, the first I ever conducted, knew this land as the palm of their hand. And to them, this was maybe a wilderness, and it was definitely a nature worthy of fearful respect. But its value did not rest in a detachment from their culture, but quite the opposite. This nature was part of their culture, and their culture was part of this land. So while I do acknowledge that it was probably the rhetoric which framed this land as untouched wilderness that secured its protection and initial establishment of the national park, I also question that framing. I find it very problematic if that is what is needed in order to feature the value of a landscape like this, especially so at present when the human being is being framed as a geological force and human impact on the environment is ever more noticeable. So to recall, it has been claimed that sustainable development perspectives are inherent to the World Heritage protection, that the World Heritage Convention promotes, in particular, environmental sustainability by valuing and conserving places of outstanding natural heritage value, and that the over 1,000 World Heritage sites worldwide can become standard-setting examples of best practice in sustainable development. I do think there is potential to realize this. However, in light of my case study, I think there is reason to ask how exactly that is to be realized. And that brings me to the very conclusion of this talk and to sustainable uncertainty. So how can World Heritage and heritage more generally set standards for best practice in sustainable development? The short answer, I say, is to get rid of the rhetoric of certainty that currently characterizes the discourse. And that includes to get rid of the normative understanding of sustainability and sustainable development. Arguing that sustainable objectives are simply inherent to the spirit of any practice is in and of itself an unsustainable perspective. The future is uncertain. We can never completely foresee the consequences of our acts, and sustainable development is therefore never simply straightforward. Heritage, including natural heritage, is a political matter. In practice, the protection of nature, such as the Vatnajökull National Park, involves the framing, the naming, the mapping, and the fencing of land, a political act which easily serves to downplay other definitions of land and to fence off perspectives and heritage that does not comply with the idealistic image of what this land should represent. I don't dare to suggest that the Kárahnjúkar Dam should have been included in the national park, and I assume that that would have been near impossible in practice. But it is interesting to imagine how that would have changed our ideas and discourse about this land. It's clear that there is a difference between the human presence at Kárahnjúkar Dam and my father and I collecting eggs from wild geese along the Jökla River. But why is it, in the first place, that human presence and human impact needs to be excluded in order to amplify the value of land as natural heritage? How is that binary thinking sustainable at present? I truly believe that World Heritage, like the Vatnajökull National Park, has much to offer in a quest for more sustainable futures. But I think that for that to be realized, the rhetoric of certainty needs to be replaced with a more humble acknowledgement of the uncertainties that we are facing. And I'm going to end with this by returning to this image, which I asked you to remember, an image of Stuðlagill Canyon, which has basically become the Relics of Nature's project's trademark image. Stuðlagill Canyon is part of the river corridor of Jökla, which is the glacial river that was dammed by Kárahnjúkar hydropower plant. The canyon is amazing, as you can see. It's an amazing natural formation showcasing the collaborative artwork of ice, water, and volcanic action. And today, as I mentioned, the canyon is among Iceland's most loved natural heritage destinations and has been voted the most photogenic spot in the country by Icelanders themselves. But what is never discussed, however, is that how the aesthetic of this place was affected and to some degree brought into being by the damming of the river. For example, that access to this place has been granted because of the lowered water surface, and that guests are now safe along the river banks because of the reduced volume of turbulent water. And not least, that the beautiful turquoise color of the water has come about because the dirt and the glacial sediment is now left in Kárahnjúkar Dam. So yet another reason to talk about the relationship between nature and culture and how and about human impact on the environment. And I've included an image of the river as it looked when I grew up with it. So thank you.